Hello and welcome to My Word is My Green Bond. Today is an exciting day because we're talking all through the day about how we can actually take the risk, how we can actually make some of the measures around sustainability and take some of the ideas and implement them relatively quickly within the banking sector. We're talking about sustainability in supply chains, how banks and non-banks can develop supply chain and guarantees that are appropriately priced to incentivize sustainability amongst their clients. The ICC report, which was published yesterday, is a definition of sustainable trade that is immensely workable and very simple for the very reason that it's associated with what the United Nations wants to do, which is achieve sustainable development goals. There's a huge amount of work that's going on at a trade association level, the ITFA, BAFT, and the ITC. But a lot of this is just talking at this stage, and how we go from that process of standardization through to implementation quickly enough to achieve the changes that we want and climate targets that we have to meet is the critical question. With me to discuss all of this are two people, and we're hoping that others will join through the course of this seminar, but seem to be delayed at present. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Patrick Beyer, who is at Strathclyde University, and Ravi Hanspal, who is a principal at the Boston Consulting Group. And Patrick, I'm going to start with you because I think you can give us the big picture in all of this space. So what are the biggest issues that you see in measuring, understanding and rewarding sustainability? How do we focus on incentivization systems, effective policy measures? What are you seeing out there?
Okay, excellent, brilliant. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for the kind introduction. And again, thanks a lot for the very welcome invitation to this event. And a very warm welcome to everyone from Glasgow, because it just happens that I'm based at Glasgow. So I'm kind of, at least spatially, really close to the action. Whether you can get there, that's a different.
So you're not in the traffic jam at the moment?
No, I'm not in the traffic jam, and I'm more than happy about that. So again, I think what's really interesting to realize, and I mean, we have seen that in the news stories before and in the media, right? That COP26 is ultimately all about the implementation, and people have caught up to that. And I think the big elephant in the room, and you already pointed to that, and I think to me that's really the biggest issue of all, is that people have understood that measurement and kind of definition of what green investment means, and then kind of what sustainability actually means when we talk about it, kind of not in loose concepts, but when we really talk about trying to implement those things into measurable actions further down the road. This, I think, is really the biggest obstacle. So I think on the measurement front, in terms of what do we actually mean when we talk about green financing, what can joint definitions be? And I think we will come back to the ICC document, which I think is very helpful in that. But kind of, I think some questions, especially kind of in the context of green bonds, for instance, we want to consider is kind of how do we what are we promised as investors in these kind of financial instruments, right? So because obviously the way I understand it, and I'm looking at a lot of those things from a regulatory political science perspective, so let's kind of bear with me on that. But I think what's to me a little bit unclear oftentimes is really what is kind of promised on top of the financial returns, right? And so if, for instance, we look at the European Union green bond that was marketed a while ago, it's kind of a little bit unclear still that, yeah, there is this green dimension to it, but how do we actually monitor it? How do we verify further down the road that the money that was promised to go into green initiative really ends up in those green initiatives rather somewhere else, right? And I think what we should bear in mind is that, especially in regard to this verification and monitoring provisions, we have seen problems in the past, for instance, in the context of the clean development mechanism or in the context of emissions trading. It's kind of once you start trying to think about how to operationalize those things and how to really measure carbon reductions that come from specific projects that might be promised to investors or so forth, it really gets fairly difficult, because oftentimes we don't really have the accounting standards that are relevant, or kind of we are measuring different things. In the context of the carbon markets in Europe, for instance, I had done work and tried to allocate emissions, because the carbon CO2 emissions to different sectors. And it just happens that the European Union kind of accounts for carbon in a very different way, or defines sectors in a very different way than what the UN Common Reporting Framework does. And kind of, so I think in all these kind of questions, it's really, what do we measure? How do we measure those things? How do we promise these to investors? And what are the promises that come with those green financing instruments? And I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of questions around there. I don't necessarily have the answers, but I see many more people kind of wondering about how do we actually go about operationalizing a lot of those instruments in order to live up or to deliver on the net zero pledges that are perfect. I mean, that underlie kind of the drive towards kind of green investment, green finance, trying to green supply chains, and all these kind of efforts, right?
So I think one of the really interesting things that comes out of that for me is the fact that, I mean, you're talking about effectively impact investing and green investing, and how the investment sector starts to look at things like green bonds. But there's something very interesting here that's going on. I mean, we've seen stock markets and so on work in different ways with green assets. They're kind of on a roll at the moment for the very simple reason that COP26 is happening and everybody's excited about it. But there are a lot of issues. And I think the biggest issue of all, and we'll come on to this and how it works in the banking space shortly, but the biggest issue of all is how we manage that transition, and how we understand from a banking and finance point of view, and also from an investment point of view, that these things can't be done overnight. And so how are markets and how's the pricing system going to work around all of that, do you think?
So, I mean, I think you're spot on. I think that the transition question is a question that that kind of puzzles all sectors, right? I mean, it's kind of whether you're talking about I don't know, carbon intensive production or power production or kind of EV, kind of electric transportation. I mean, I think all these sectors essentially have to adjust. And so it kind of, yeah, you need to come up with some sort of credible transition path from where we are right now to where we want to be in the future. And I mean, I think ultimately it needs to be kind of a mix of things that need to happen to facilitate that transition, right? And I think some aspects are in the regulatory space, where you think that just, I mean, once carbon dependent industries become well, or kind of once carbon prices say rise, right, those carbon dependent sectors will certainly, there will be impacts on the assets that those companies hold, and obviously that will feed back into the financial market. So I think there will be a drive away from very carbon intensive investments if the regulatory environment is the right in terms of introducing carbon prices, for instance, right? But obviously there's also issues again in terms of what actually consumers want, at least for the consumer side of things. And I think as this pressure builds, we will probably see that kind of transition to kind of how fast it'll be and how exactly it will evolve. I think this is for the future to tell. But I think there needs to be a combination of more or less investment incentives by government. There needs to be regulatory incentives. We probably also need to have a conversation about cutting back on fossil fuel subsidies and these kind of things, right? And obviously, I mean, all of these will kind of these form more fundamental elements will feed back into the financial industry, and the financial industry will have to respond to those, right?
So, I mean, again, for me, it's just the huge complexity of all of this, and I think Ravi is probably thinking, I know where she's going with this, because I mean, the whole space is so complicated, isn't it? And there are so many layers, and we mustn't forget as well that this isn't just about sustainability in an environmental sense. One of the things that's come out of the last few days has been we have to think about social impact as well, and there are all sorts of ways of doing this, and we're working on some geospatial modeling for all of this, and it's incredibly complex as an area, and it's stuffed full of vested interests as well. I mean, my biodiversity is your not being able to provide a livelihood to a community working somewhere. It's a very, very difficult situation. So Ravi, as the person who has been very heavily involved with the ICC report, which came out yesterday, and the positioning paper around what trade finance has to do in this space, what are the key takeaways? What have you learned the most about making this simple and ultimately implementable? And I'm happy to come in on the implementation side, but the areas that you've focused around and the lessons that you've learned will be really interesting, I think, to know more about.
Sure. No, and look, thank you again for the introduction and the invitation to speak. So I guess I'll almost start with the opposite end of your question about where does the complexity come from? And I think to do that, we need to look at two things, and this is very much a learning curve throughout the ICC process. So number one is the complexity of sustainability, and then number two is the complexity of trade. So particularly the COP26 and the like, a lot of people, and even green bonds and sustainable finance, the whole green element has been quite well documented, quite well thought about. But more and more, as you say, sustainability is recognized as being far more than just green and just the environment and just climate. And this is really important for trade, because trade is effectively a key engine of global development, economic development, and human development. To give one example, if you were to call a supply chain sustainable purely because, let's say it was net zero, fantastic achievement, we're all aiming there. But then there are human rights issues at the raw material stage, then it negates the fact that it's sustainable. It is not sustainable by any definition. So I think one thing we discovered during the ICC work is that actually to call trade sustainable, given the amount of international work across value chains, across different emerging markets, developed markets, it's essential to look at sustainability holistically. And as such, we've actually modeled the whole ICC recommendation on an adapted version of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, so that we capture the economic, the human, social, as well as the environmental elements of sustainability. So I suppose that was lesson one. The other is, and actually walking into the whole process, I guess maybe we were a little bit naive. We didn't realize quite how complex trying to work out whether a transaction is sustainable can be. And that's really because of the complexity of trade. So if you look at a single trade transaction, we typically say there are at least 20 plus actors involved. You think about the importer, the exporter, their banks, insurers, shippers, freight forwarders, etc. It's just very complex due to the number of entities involved. And then if you look at trade itself, because it's a flow business, you can't necessarily just attribute its sustainability on the end goal. So for example, if there's a project to build a renewable energy farm, like a wind farm, quite often from a green bond perspective, that's classed as sustainable. It's a sustainable purpose, it's a project with a sustainable goal to mitigate climate change. Whereas actually when you start looking at the transaction level, at a transaction level basis of trade finance, you need to test, well, are the raw goods being exchanged, or are the goods being exchanged sustainable? Is the seller's business or exporter's business sustainable? Is the buyer or the importer sustainable? How is it transported? Is it heavy goods air freighted for the sake of it? So is that sustainable? And what is the end purpose? Is it to build a coal power plant? Is it to build a wind farm? So actually taking all of these different elements, you start to realize that trade is inherently complex, and there's no one single black and white definition of this is sustainable, this is not. And that kind of takes us to how we shape the ICC framework. And we came to a decision as a group that actually the number one thing we need to provide is visibility rather than judgment necessarily. Where and why, at this specific stage of a transaction, is it sustainable? And then leave that information for the user to apply how they want to. So for example, many organizations might be perfectly happy to count within the sustainable portfolios anything with a sustainable purpose. Others might care a lot about the actual goods being exchanged. And then also, when you actually start to think about portfolios from a bank perspective or an asset management perspective, people do care. Is this sustainable because it's environmentally sustainable, because it's sort of human and socially sustainable, economically sustainable? So what we've effectively gone for as an overarching approach is, here is all of the information in a very straightforward way, but actually how you use that is where a lot of the work needs to be put, because there is no black and white definition in that sense. I hope that answers your question, Rebecca.
It does, and I think, you know, the really astonishing finding, trade's big, you know, and sustainability is big. You know, we're talking about the planet here, and I remember when I was a chief economist at a think tank, and I won't say which because I'll spare the blushes of the president at the time, but he said to me, "Do you know what, Rebecca? The one thing that you've taught me while you've been here is the fact that everything is interdependent." And everything, particularly in this sustainability space, is interdependent. And I think that's what, you know, Patrick's been talking about and what you've been talking about, that, you know, it's like trying to tune an engine. You twist one little bit of it and the other bit of it goes out of sync. So the core challenge is to look at what the essence of this is. And obviously sustainable development goals are the things that can be seen as sustainable. Now, obviously, from a Coriolis point of view, we have an agenda in that, because what we've done is we've matched the trade flows to the sustainable development goals, which means that we now have a mechanism for hooking the implementation up with those types of objectives. But I noticed that Swaroop has now come on, so I'm going to bring him in. Swaroop, I guess I'd say this is all quite something for banks, isn't it? This whole sustainability agenda, because none of us is particularly a sustainability expert. We're not the people that go and manage biodiversity in woodlands or talk about climate change policy. After all, we're all interested in helping our clients, our supply chains and our own organisations to become more sustainable. So Swaroop, what are the real issues as you see this from the ICC report? And Patrick was talking about the general area of investments as well. What are the real issues that you see?
Thank you, Rebecca. First of all, apologies. Somehow I got my calendar wrong on this, but managed to come in at the right time, I guess. But you know, the topic, and I heard Ravi's last part on the interdependent and your comments on the interdependent nature, and I couldn't agree more. And we've spent a lot of time on this topic together as well, me and Ravi, both at ICC and the recent joint white paper that we published on supply chain transition. And clearly this interdependent and interdisciplinary nature of solutions come out very, very prominently in both of them. Coming to the point you make about banks and financial institutions, I think there is a very, very strong realization across the banking community and across the financial system on need for change and need for rapid change. And we see that, and I'll come to what I mean in a moment. The revolutions that we have seen in the past have taken decades together, you know, multi-decade revolutions. But I think given the scale, size, and the nature of the problem we are dealing here, the revolution that we need here will be far more time crunched in that sense to save the planet, because we really need this change to happen in the next decade or so for us to be able to then sustain and move in that direction in the following decade. So I think we are going to see a very rapid change in the way organizations look at this topic. in the financial sector, there is a very strong need to embed climate and the wider ESG risk in our risk models, which has been there, but it's not futuristic in the sense that our risk models in the past have always been based on historical data, historical matrices. Whereas for sustainability and ESG space, we need to look at this from a futuristic standpoint, and that's where institutions are moving from. Our modeling has to talk about future scenarios and have risk models take care of that, and our risk decisioning also move in that direction. The other thing that is very, very important is to look at this holistically, both from a problem statement perspective as well as from a solution point of view, because of the interconnected nature of this problem, the multidisciplinary solutions that will be needed to solve this, and also the ability to have, unintended consequences if we don't do this holistically is very high. Therefore, we need to look at this very, very holistically. And the third piece I would say is to have a very clear view on scope 3. While addressing 1 and 2, there is a very large part which exists in scope 3, and that's where trade finance and this piece plays such a critical role that we need to address the scope 3 part of the emissions very, very strongly while addressing 1 and 2. I think these are the 3 main things from a risk standpoint that institutions are seeing. There's a lot of work that is happening, and no single actor can do this alone. I think everybody realizes that by now. We need all players, governments, policy, banks, technology institutions, data, transparency, and a lot of other things coming together to make this happen. I think we are moving in the right direction. I see a lot of activism now across institution and also at a policy level to really make that quantum change. But what will define this is real action on the ground. And one of our efforts in the recent paper is that to really come out with actionable points on what is required to make sustainable supply chain transition. And that is what we are trying to drive home with our complete stakeholders and the ecosystem, so to say.
I think this issue, I mean, there are 2 issues there. One is the whole risk management. I'll get Patrick to come in because I think on that, because I think there's something around bringing the investment markets and the banking and finance and trade finance markets together, because the whole process has to be standardized. And this is the purpose of the ICC paper. We need those common things, but then over and above that, as you very rightly said, Swaroop, we have to do this together. And I think the announcement yesterday that the US and China are actually starting to work together finally on all of this, it's actually very good news. And I think what the ICC paper has done is actually pull together the community and say, right, nobody can do this by ourselves. We're not competing in this space. I mean, it's the ultimate technology dream, isn't it? Everybody's collaborating, and so Patrick, what's your view of both of those things? One is risk models and how we go about standardizing those and implementing those so that they mean something and genuinely do make a difference, as Swaroop says, quickly, because this is what we need to do. But the other thing is, how do we all collaborate around all of this?
Well, I mean, I think you guys pointed on the right dimension. I mean, I think the key level really is cooperation, and I think again, kind of from the discussion we've had about kind of this being a holistic problem, right? I think from a government or from a regulator's perspective, right? The interesting aspect, obviously, is that sustainability cuts or kind of involves everything around the globe, as we've said. So you have this interconnectedness. But then obviously from a regulatory or country policymakers perspective, right? Countries kind of have borders. And so from their challenge, I think it's really kind of trying, how can we overcome these national borders in terms of implementing regulatory frameworks that kind of help us to avoid the possibilities that industries that's kind of, and their supply chains that cut across those borders would undermine the intent of some of these kind of policies, right? And here I'm very much appreciative of Swaroop's point about scope 3 emissions and kind of all the debate about carbon leakage, and then kind of as Ravi has also been saying earlier about, well, it might actually be that we kind of outsource let's say, human rights violations that are related to some of the products we consume, to essentially markets where we don't see them, and therefore kind of that might change consumers' perception in quite a significant way, right? And so I think for me, the response to that in regard to managing the risk is, as Swaroop has been emphasizing before, I think we need this kind of multi-layered cooperation between governments, between civil society, between financial intermediaries, kind of at all those levels, in order to really be able to more or less cut otherwise this chain of governments or regulatory frameworks kind of trying to chase some of the market participants that might have an incentive to not readily comply with some of the rules, right? And so I think, as I said before in my introductory statement, I think kind of what sits on top of that is really a good assessment of transparency and data availability. And I think this is kind of I've been working with some data on the Carbon Disclosure Project, firm level data, and I mean there again, if you look at kind of how difficult some of those processes are and how difficult it is for firms to even quantify and think, well, what actually are my scope 3 emissions, right? I think some more homework needs to be done kind of on an informational standpoint, but I think information plus kind of the willingness to cooperate between key actors is actually what can get us out of this mess and can facilitate this transition, even at the accelerated timescales that are necessary to keep us or to keep this 1.5 alive, and to keep this SDG agenda kind of beyond climate alive.
From a personal perspective as an economist, there are so many things to unpack there. There's a regulatory framework, there's the quantity of data that you need to be able to assess all of this. But I think the most interesting point from the point of view of collaboration and trade is this idea that we still need to deal with all of this on a multilateral framework, don't we? We still, you know, this is it, we can't go along the lines in trade terms that we have been going along for the last five or 6 years, which is increased economic nationalism, and we saw that through the COVID pandemic. We can't do that. Ravi, I noticed in the document that there was a lot of discussion about these SDGs being measurable at a country level, so we can actually start to balance, can't we, the relationship between the country and the company, and actually add in a layer of risk. So we're not just talking in trade finance about political risk anymore, or the risk of fraud. We're also looking at the risks associated with the country if they don't have a proper regulatory framework. And I don't know whether you want to comment on that, but I would just add that what the United States is doing at the moment, even though it's announced that it's working with China on climate changes, it's also altering the way it's been through this major supply chain review. And that major supply chain review says, well, companies that are exhibiting anything in relation to human rights abuses are going to be very closely scrutinized by the Department of Commerce. So, you know, there's a lot going on in this space. How does your framework help us to understand those country issues and the need for multilateralism?
So it's an interesting point. So one of the things we debated quite a lot in putting together the proposals is, if a country has a poor record on any ESG dimension, what does that mean for how you'd effectively tag them as a trade transaction when assessing the sustainability? And I suppose the easy way about it would be like blacklist countries if they don't comply with X, Y, Z. But the problem is that it's the same like saying, oh, we can't provide any green finance to a coal firm that's trying to transition. You can't block off funding or block off access to the markets and hope to finance change at the same time. You actually need to encourage the right behaviors and recognize the right behaviors rather than basically cutting off certain types of transactions. So what we actually proposed is, and this is a hypothesis, and we need to think about the workability, is rather than actually basing any of the assessment on a country's track, and there might be some blacklists, sanctions and everything, of course, but rather than basing the assessment of a transaction on the country's track record of ESG, is actually focused on the transaction itself, so you can recognize and reward positive change. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily have different standards, no, but it means that if a country, if a supplier is trying to change the status quo, and you can evidence that, then that should be recognized as sustainable. So that's sort of one critical element. The other point is that we do, however, need to recognize that you can't always apply the same standards to every country. So, for example, a key one is coal power. The access to clean energy varies substantially country to country. And again, what you don't want to do is actually inadvertently take sustainability as a way of penalizing countries that are yet to transition. So that was another key element. And I think one thing that will have to come out of the next phase of the framework is, where do we specifically have these country nuances? So for example, do we actually assess the standards of energy usage on what's available within that country, or relative to what's available in that country, as to generally across the overall sort of Western world playing field? There's quite a lot we need to figure out around that. But I think the general learning you had is hard and fast black and white rules really don't work, because moving on back from my first point, this is such a complicated topic, and if it were easy, it'd already be done.
Exactly. And Swaroop, I'm going to bring you in. I know you want to come in there. It's about not being punitive, isn't it? It's about having a system that doesn't actually penalize anybody and allows them to be educated and move from where they are now to where they want to be.
So look, I mean, this is a very, very debated topic, right? And it's important to understand that transition is very, very different for different clients and different geographies. And so there are different elements to balance here. One is the whole debate between developing and the developed world, which is massively pronounced, and you have seen elements of that at COP26 as well. There is also this element of sectors and companies. So the issues that you face at a large corporate and a global multinational corporate who can spend much more money on sustainability and creating frameworks and driving some change within organization, to the smaller organizations are very different. So mid-markets and SMEs face very different issues. So we need to look at this from both lenses. And there are some very good examples, right? I would like to really quote this example, which was recently announced at the COP, which is this energy transition mechanism between ADB and HSBC is also signed up to this, which is basically helping retire coal assets early. And also, it's not just retirement of coal assets, it's also transitioning them to energy efficient solutions. So this is an alliance which has been announced in 3 of the ASEAN countries as a pilot by ADB. And it's a perfect example of collaboration where expertise between multiple institutions can come together and help transitioning sectors and economies altogether. And Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam are economies where this is being piloted. And it's a very, very good example of how you can come together. And we have seen similar examples in supply chain transition. We've ourselves had a collaboration with ADB on that. We've also seen sustainable supply chain examples. And data can play a very, very critical role here to be able to drive that change and improve behaviors of different actors in the chain. The other key thing to keep in mind is the cost of these technologies. So while there is a lot of push from the large corporates and companies to drive this change, in order for this to be able or implementable at an SME and mid-market level, the access and cost of these technologies has to be very, very low in order for adoption to be high. Because for SMEs to adopt this, while there is still consumer behavior change happening, it is still not completely happened. There has to be a strong incentive for them to have make that change, and that has to be driven partly by sharing the cost across the ecosystem. And this is where the need for us to collaborate across the value chain comes in, where large corporates have almost a responsibility to make sure that they take ecosystem MMEs and SMEs together in driving this transition. So some of this has already started happening in industries. So leaders in this space have already started taking those early steps towards driving this behavior across value chain. But I think more needs to be done, and policy initiatives there would help, and standardization, etc., would certainly help to drive finance. So that's the third element, that the flow of finance also needs to completely replicate this sort of behavior, that we start financing value chain based on these behaviors being exhibited.
I think there's something really interesting around that, and audience, I'd ask you to come in with any questions. If you want to pop questions in the chat for panel members, you're very welcome to. But I mean, I have so many questions on all of this, because one of the things that you've done is highlight the difference between what we have talked about in terms of supply chains and what we should be talking about. And this is something that's come out over the last few days, which is actually value chains. So where are we adding value across value chains? How do we incentivize those companies which are often in emerging markets, which do have to transition and which maybe don't have the skills and the context in order to be able to transition quickly? How do we help them do all of that? Ravi, I don't know whether you want to come in on that, or Swaroop, anybody, interrupt free for all, because it's kind of the $1 trillion question at the moment. How do you get this to work through the whole value chain?
I think one of the ways, and I don't want to completely take the whole time myself, open for ideas, is to have a collaborative approach between large corporates, and it need not be completely investment based approach. A lot of these companies also need support in terms of the know-how and implementing these strategies. So, some of the SMEs and mid-markets don't have ability to implement technologies, even if they're willing to spend, to then measure it, keep, benchmark it, and monitor it on an ongoing basis. So if value chain partners can actually come together and enable that, that would be a good way of supporting SMEs. And a lot of large corporates are already doing it with the help of fintechs and third-party providers. So that's something which can easily be implemented. The other place where I think there is a lot that can be done is this whole multilateral collaboration and leveraging the risk-sharing expertise and the know-how that they have in emerging markets to channel and unlock finance for these partners with the help of capital markets and others is very, very critical, because there is a lot of finance waiting to go into ESG sort of transition finance, but there is no means or access to really channel this money to the value chain and down in the value chain to the SMEs and mid markets. So I think their data and technology have a very critical role. So if we can actually create those enabling mechanisms or frameworks to channel money and formats to channel money to SMEs, that will be a big change. That will really make a quantum change. And some of the examples I quoted are exactly of that. The ETM example, or our partnership with ADB, which we did at the peak of pandemic to channel COVID vaccines, was actually a very good example which can be replicated to ESG. So, these are some quick things that one can do to really start unlocking value chain transition.
And just building on what Swaroop's saying, I wholeheartedly agree. And it's actually the crux of a paper we released with HSBC around achieving net zero supply chains. And just to throw out a few numbers that might surprise people, I think we estimate 80% of effectively carbon emissions come from global supply chains in some shape or form. And about 20 to 50% of the total investment needed to realize net zero across supply chains needs to get to these SMEs. And if you give SMEs the funding, getting it there is difficult in itself, but they wouldn't know what to do with it necessarily. So it is a huge amount of the problem, as Swaroop said, is actually getting that knowledge and capability transfer from academia, large organizations, big buyers, financial institutions perhaps, down to the SMEs who need them is a critical enabler. I think financing is a big one, and there are many mechanisms we can think of, for example, green supply chain finance and the like, that could really help there and move the needle. But at the back of my mind, the sheer amount of work needed just points me in the direction of, again, technology and data is going to be a key lever in plugging that gap. How do we know what's sustainable? How do we sort of share information across supply chains? And I think that's also where collaboration is needed. If you look at things such as KYC and anti-money laundering, I think as a financial system, we haven't necessarily cracked consistency there in terms of common data models and stuff. And I think hopefully the sort of sustainability agenda will be a good second crack at that. so that we can have common data models across actually sharing credentials between different organizations, financial institutions, and so on.
I think what's interesting on that is actually that the learning from the AML KYC thing is that it was punitive. So the whole thing has been, right, we're excluding a whole bunch of people from this type of financing because they're not meeting our AML KYC criteria. And what that's done is actually create the trade finance gap. It's created the gap, particularly in emerging markets, for smaller businesses to transition into this space. And, you know, that's critically about transitioning the supply chain, making sure that the supply chain is going down to that very lowest level, do you think?
Yeah, and I think the one thing that worries me a little bit is that one of the ideas you sometimes hear discussed are, could large organizations have sustainability audits? And you might fall into that same trap, which means that all of the largest organizations would appear to be the cleanest because it's the most evidenced. Whereas, and that could leave behind the smaller organizations who, they can't afford large-scale audits and the sustainability credentials. They don't have the means of measuring their credentials. So it's quite easy to fall into a trap as well. And it just falls back onto collaboration across the whole supply chain is crucial to make sure nobody gets left behind.
So I think this point about punitive, you're absolutely right. And I'm agreeing with everybody. And I'll let Patrick come in on how we regulate for all of this in a second. But the key thing is not to make that transition punitive. It's to make it almost like an education process, isn't it? So we have to educate people about how to invest in a more sustainable way, how to regulate in a more sustainable way, but most of all through their supply chains, how to behave in a more sustainable way. Patrick, it's the ultimate chaos theory, isn't it?
Well, I mean, kind of just, I think on those points, I really like a lot what I'm hearing, but just to emphasize the what we've heard, and I think that also speaks to your question about regulatory frameworks, Rebecca, there. I think for one, I think as we said, the supply chain and the value chain, I think these are immensely powerful in the sense that this can really be a fast track to scale up decarbonization in the developing world, right? Because I think ultimately, otherwise, we are facing this scenario or this kind of undesirable outcome that we might end up in a world in which much of the developed world kind of meets their net zero targets by 2050, but we're nowhere anywhere near in the global south. And so I think this story about kind of trying to share best practices and kind of leveraging those connections throughout the value and supply chains, I think this will be critical at a firm level to more or less fast track that development. And I think that goes very well in hand when we talk about recent developments around climate finance at COP and kind of trying to think more systematically about how to more or less combine public and private climate finance in the context of these climate fund and the kind of magic 100 billion there, right? So I think that's one point. And I think the other point that I want to highlight or slightly put it in different words was what Ravi has been saying is again key, that I think even in the European Union emissions trading market, right, we have seen a lot of the smaller regulated installations struggle really quite dramatically in terms of providing the necessary data to the European regulator and the European Commission, right? And this is in a more or less highly institutionalized setup where you think, okay, this is on paper, right? These are all kind of installations in developed countries, so they should have the capacity to essentially submit all the emissions information and all the data that the regulators need. Obviously, these problems become kind of manifold, more problematic in the context of the developing world. And so I think we really need to think about whatever regulatory frameworks or whatever demands we make in terms of information and data provision, that we also kind of put in place some facilitative instruments that provide finance and best practice sharing and capacities for especially these kind of mid-sized, smaller-sized firms to be able to not lose out and as Ravi has been saying, kind of appear as if they weren't compliant or they aren't green, but this is really down to capacity rather than kind of not wanting to be green or something, right? And so I think there is some, we need to think creatively about that, and regulatory instruments need to acknowledge that they need to provide the facilitative capabilities in place to ensure against that risk in a sense.
I guess I'm all super fascinating. There's a slightly political question coming in here, which I guess you may or may not want to answer. But I mean, it's quite clear that taking a step back and the regulations of the whole supply chain, we need to think about how we're making all of those things consistent, and that's what the ICC report's done. That's what Ravi's been saying. And if we don't do that, then we're not consistent. But there's just a slightly political element to this as well. So England planning to open its first coal mine in Cumbria. Can we regulate one way and open a coal mine in another? What are the sustainability consequences of that? Go for it, Patrick. You're the independent.
Well, I mean, I think so. Again, and I haven't done any kind of really kind of emissions accounting type of thing on the back of that, and I don't necessarily want to defend the UK government here, because my initial instinct would be, well, no, it's kind of certainly not the policies we'd like to see. I mean, for multiple reasons, right? I mean, I think for one, just reputationally in the year in which you host COP and kind of promote yourself as a climate leader among the OECD countries, it's just, I mean, not very reasonable to have that debate. I think on another level, but then essentially on another level, the question is, well, kind of with all this energy transition, right, especially for governments, there is the question about energy security, right? And I mean, kind of, there are quite a bit of distributional consequences for governments that come from rapid decarbonization. And so there is, if we think about just transition, if we think about more or less former coal communities, if we think about kind of the urban-rural divide in terms of development, then, I mean, there are some questions to be said about, well, how can we transition those regions sustainably into a new world? I mean, again, my hope would be that, especially in a developed country context as the UK, we should have other means to essentially level up these regions rather than opening a coal mine. But I mean, there are more dimensions to it rather than just saying, okay, let's open up this new coal mine, which might seem otherwise ridiculously kind of non-fitting for what the UK government promotes itself to be otherwise. But yeah, I think it's a difficult question, and I think it's even more difficult in developing country context, where obviously the outside options are quite different compared to what the UK government has, right? But nonetheless, I mean, I think we have seen with energy prices going through the roof that even in developing countries contexts, as long as we miss the interconnectedness of electricity markets, I think there is something to be said about kind of how to ensure, or energy security, let's put it that way, is certainly high up on the priority for national governments in that transition, right? And I think that's something we need to recognize.
So this ties in with what you're saying, and I wouldn't ask you, of course, to comment on a UK political issue, but it ties in with what you and Ravi and Patrick have all been saying about the need to bring everybody along through the supply chain. So, I mean, we're beginning to get close to the end of the session. Maybe you'd like to make your sort of wrap-up contribution. What are your views on how we actually go about doing that? And in 12 months' time, when we're all back here and we're all talking about what we've done to implement all of these changes, what are we going to be saying?
So, there are three things that, and I've said this before as well, where fundamentally every organization, country, and it's the same lens which everybody has to use in their influence sphere, so to say. The first thing is to reevaluate your business model and the country model on your value chains, and the point around coal also fits in here. On we may not be able to switch off today on coal, but what is the plan? How can we actually transition and retire those assets earlier and move away from them in a reasonable time frame, considering our 1.5 degree target or another reasonable target in the larger scheme of things. So that is one. So reevaluate your supply chains, value chains, and business. from an ESG lens, and balancing E and S here is very important, the holistic point which I was mentioning. The second piece is to reconfigure them and reconfigure them with a view that you have transition happening and balancing the S in the short term, and also ensuring that we are meeting the long-term targets of fair and just transition over a long period of time. And then the third piece is to enable that with financing. So refinancing these value chains by different means, not just by bank financing, but also helping them by the ecosystem and bringing the ecosystem together by governments, policymakers, regulatory action, and ensuring that there are different channels of finance which flow into this, including from capital markets. There is already some very good work here from regulatory side, which is already happening. And you may have seen all the activism that's in EU. HKMA has published some guidance around sustainable financing, and they're doing some very good work. There's already guidance in the US, which is coming out on how they will look at non or brown assets, so to say, in future, and how would capital charge linked to these would, will start to move subject to data and of course further analysis. And similar paper has been published by EU very recently. So some of these policy actions which naturally tilt financing towards ESG and green, but this activism has to come from all levels of organizations. Government, corporates, mid-markets, and SMEs have to really look at all these 3 R's in their organization and channel change there.
Thank you. And Patrick, could you give us your views on what we'll be talking about in 12 months' time and how we get there? I guess there's also a question here which you might want to address, which is around carbon offsetting and the role in sustainability transition for large companies. Maybe you'd like to put that into your response as well.
Okay, well, I mean, I think, well, it's kind of, I think the important point to realize is, as we said before, right, it's all about implementation. So I think a lot of the questions we are having now, we will have the same kind of questions, I think, in 12 months' time. But hopefully we've come a bit more, kind of, we've come further, kind of along the way, a little bit of better understanding what the informational demands are, what is the kind of cooperation, what's the learning that we need to facilitate in order to get where we want to be. And I think, again, I do get some optimism out of COP, I'd say, and I think there is a drive that more and more actors kind of across different layers are really taking this 1.5 seriously, and then kind of it seems that a lot of organizations have caught up to the idea that we need to act and we need to act now, and I think there's a lot of good kind of spirit and drive in the right direction. It might not be yet at the pace we might need it, but nonetheless, I think we have started that journey, and I think that's good news. So I think we will revisit a lot of those questions in 12 months' time. I think on the offsetting, again, I think it depends. The critical point, and we've seen offsetting in the context of clean development mechanism out of the Kyoto Protocol before. I think the one issue here again, I think, is you need to be a little bit sensitive to different types of firms and what their business models are. Obviously, the hope would be that for most part, they try to decarbonize their operations as they are rather than offset, right? But I think you also need to recognize that in some industries, aviation, for instance, it might be insanely difficult to do that, right? And so I think offsetting can be understood as a transition mechanism to take those sectors along this path to net zero, with the understanding that certainly you want to have some sort of quality control what gets offset, right? It shouldn't be just some kind of thin air and kind of, you want to have some kind of a real offset in a sense that can be used against whatever firms are offsetting. But yeah, I mean, there's a whole big debate about that, and I don't necessarily want to go into details here. But I think as a transition kind of policy instrument under regulatory frameworks, it can work to some extent. But you might also want to think whether you want to phase it out and kind of decrease the share of what permits, say, could be used from offsetting compared to what you expect those firms to do more or less domestically across their operations.
Thank you. Ravi, last word to you. You've set the framework for standardisation. You have a lot of hope attached to that. You want to engage the business community, the international community. One of the things that's been absolutely clear from this session is we all need to work together. So what are we going to be doing in 12 months' time? What are we going to be saying that we've achieved?
Sure. That's the $1 million question. So I think we've done a lot of good work on the what. So what do we want to achieve? How do we think we can actually get to a consistent, consistent definition, framework, etc. I think what the next 12 months is really about is getting to that next level of detail on the how. So tangibly, what does this mean in practice for corporates, banks, the trade community? What specific standards are we going to apply to populate this framework? So in effect, it's actually the action plan that I think we need to work on. And I think if we sort of fast forward 12 months time and we're able to go live with a fairly simple framework, fine, but actually have a tangible plan to reach a consistent way of measuring trade for sustainability credentials, I think we'd be in a great place. So let's move the sort of theory to actions is my hope.
Fantastic. Swaroop, Patrick, Ravi, you've been absolutely fantastic. This has been a really interesting panel. And I think the takeaway for me is, number one, this is difficult and complicated, and everything depends on everything else. So we need to start with something very simple. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to hook the regulatory and the supply chain / value chain systems around all of that. And we really need to work together quickly and immediately on the next steps, because those are what are going to make the difference. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I'd just say to everybody who's on the call, we start again at 12:30, and we're going to be looking at blockchain and how blockchain and digital solutions can help us with this whole agenda. Thank you very much indeed for your time, and see you all again at 12:30. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.